Thank you very much. I'm Jaice DuMars. I work at Google in Cloud Native Strategy. And my compatriot here is?
My name is Caleb Miles, and I work alongside Jaice in open source strategy at Google.
So one of the top voted topics for this Contributor Summit was all about KEPs, because a lot of people don't know what a KEP is, what it's for, what the lifecycle is. What we're actually trying to accomplish by having this as a part of our ecosystem for contributors. And just as a show of hands, how many people in the room feel like you have a pretty good handle on what a KEP is? Okay, well, we're done. I'll see you later. Legitimately, yeah.
I mean, this is amazing. I mean,
yes.
We were on this stage, or a similar stage, in Austin last year, yeah. Introducing KEPs to the community, and now we've got a whole side of the room where knows what KEPs are. So that's pretty great.
We're trending in the right direction. So let's just give a little background. So KEP History, you may recognize the person in this slide. He's amazingly standing right beside me today. Volunteered to share the stage because Caleb has really been the driving force for this as an important part of our ecosystem. And it started with a pull request out there about how we could adopt the REST RFC process. And thanks to version control, you can actually go out and look at this yourself and see the history of that conversation. And as that merged and evolved, Caleb sort of morphed this into some new territory, which looked at maybe hybridization between the REST RFC process and the Python PEP process. So you want to give a little rundown on sort of your process there? And
I mean, it was just a lot of looking at what other open source projects are doing. I mean, I spent a bunch of time working with Jaice, Joe Beta, and other members of the community, trying to help lay the foundation for a governance structure that would allow us to manage our success. This is part of that effort, looking at the Rust community, looking at the Python community, looking at how the Apache project develops software, how OpenStack develops their sub-projects. It was just a lot of looking at what's out there. And thanks to open source, that's actually possible. All of the source material is there on the internet, so it just takes time and motivation.
Yes, prior art being a very important part of this. So one of the complaints we've run into or concerns is that the KEP process inherently has certain aspects like managing metadata that are a little tricky to do as humans. And if anybody's ever had a merge conflict with the KEP numbering file, you can definitely attest to that being one of the pain points. And Caleb has really taken on a sort of massive task to think about how we could create a library around the KEP functionality that would allow the introduction of CLIs to manage KEP lifecycle, which makes great. It's a super exciting project, and he's made a lot of headway on that. And so, yeah.
And one of the things we promised on that stage in Austin was that we would make automation as it made sense to the community. Not to replace your interaction with the KEP process, but to kind of augment it, to make you more productive at what you're doing. I really love the idea of automation as kind of the Iron Man suit versus Voltron, automation technology is supposed to help you do your job as a human more effectively, not replace you or make the only things that you interact with incredibly complicated so that you are forced to fail at 3 a.m. because we're all human.
So, what's up?
Actually, we could go. So this is not yet in a Kubernetes organization repository. But the library is coming along. I can, if you pull me aside afterwards, I can talk about the difficulty of trying to write software when your job isn't that on a day-to-day basis. But we've been able to get out some stuff, and we're about to start collecting feedback. So that's super exciting. The library is kind of organized here. It's the world's worst README is in there today at github.com, /KEPs. There's tooling to help migrate to what we're thinking is going to be the next iteration of what a KEP is. There's tooling to help you play around with KEPs themselves. Like we've been talking about with the contributor playground. There's stuff to help you with that. There's a basic MVP code for managing the lifecycle of an individual KEP to implementation. So that's what we got so far.
Yep. And we'll talk about the tool and the workflow, because really the tool is intended to mirror the human workflow at this point. So more on that in a bit. So just a quick bit on why KEPs. As Brian had mentioned earlier in the first session about the proposal process before was very organic, to be kind, and it did not necessarily serve the needs of conveying the value of what was being delivered in the community. It was also relatively loose in terms of the life cycle of the proposal and approvals, and it was really hard to use a proposal as a way to establish trust between the author and whoever was supposed to approve it. So one of the things that Caleb in his design is really thinking about is change being at the speed of trust. Because if we think about all the things we do as a community, when you have trust between yourself and whoever is acting as the next step in a process, it makes it much faster. And a lot of the times that's human in our culture, but at this scale, we're losing the ability to have human trust be the foundation. And so we need to really start relying on process with certain assurances associated with it.
And if you, like me, work at a very large corporation, you are probably familiar with your own internal launch process. That's created because it's very difficult to organize a cross-functional team to deliver value, presumably to your own customers. It's a challenge everywhere. And this is trying to help us as a open source community have something similar that allows us to propose and manage the delivery of value to our users. Because that's, at the end of the day, hopefully why we're all here.
Yeah, so essentially, we need a life cycle around these things. We need to alleviate duplication of effort. So the KEP is intended to eventually be a rallying point for many different things. It's the one piece of data with many views concept. So we want to make sure that we're not copying, pasting. We want to make sure that there's a record of note and that it has a history of custody with it and approvals and all that stuff in one place, so that as somebody, an archaeologist comes to this project in 20 years and wants to see what happened, literally the KEP can give you key decision points, where things were included or not included, where they were obviated or moved forward. And currently that's really difficult to come by in our ecosystem.
Yeah, and this is part of a larger effort to help create a sense of organizational history for the project, so we can actually look at what happened, why did it happen, and learn from our successes and failures. Because that's why we have libraries. Because without storing information, you cannot operate, can't improve.
So again, KEPs are a way of having consistency, and so for me, when I look at a KEP, it's easier to review because I know where things are at in a KEP. I can expect that there's certain things that are going to be there. Proposals didn't necessarily have as same of a format. Again, lifecycle can be tracked, and again, single artifact, multiple purposes. So when do you need a KEP? This is a common question, and really, and this is language directly from the repo, is that if it's something that needs to be described either written or verbally to someone else besides the KEP author, it should be a KEP. Because essentially you're trying to convey a sense of value or delivery of something that's important to the ecosystem. You want to have that as succinct and well described and as crafted as possible. And of course, the weird statue there, if you tried to describe that to somebody, you probably wouldn't do a great job. So it'd be good to have it written down for what that's worth. And yeah, so it's really about it's codifying your thoughts into something that can be shared.
And a great source of the kind of importance about why you need to fully motivate enhancements is, I think Russ Cox did a beautiful job explaining that in a blog post about working towards Go-To. If operating at a large open source project, you've got precious minutes a day to review proposals, enhancements, requests, And having more pros is really helpful in order to understand why your proposed enhancement is important.
So anatomy of a KEP is essentially a few things. There's a metadata section, which heretofore has been human managed. Obviously, a tool is going to be better at handling that than people. Motivation is your chance to say why this is important, what is the value, and how is it being delivered. The summary is a sort of TLDR of what the KEP is that can be shared across different stakeholder processes. So in the release process, in order to understand what a KEP is delivering, I don't necessarily need to read the entire KEP. I would rather read something consumable as a release team member that allows me to know roughly what is happening here. And if I need to delve into more detail, I can actually just go to the KEP itself or look at associated pull requests or issues and whatnot. And then the artifacts themselves are really, this is gearing up for the future of Kubernetes, where we have much more defined artifacts that are important for everything that we release out in the community. I mean, currently we have documentation, some of those things, but we want to expand that to things like user experience reports so that we know when a feature is being used in the field and that we can talk about those being a motivation for promoting from, say, alpha to beta and beta to GA specifically, so that we can start gathering these, the data necessarily to fill out these artifacts much earlier in the process as well. If you're thinking about docs from the get-go, from the actual conception, then that's going to make your road through the release process much easier because these things will be handled much earlier on.
And this is kind of where we depart from the traditional launch process you may be familiar with at your, in your corporate homes. The KEP process is really about tracking the delivery of value. So you could consider it a landing process if you're into hand-wavy buzzwords.
So a quick look at programmatically managed metadata. This is generated via CLI from Caleb's library. And essentially what this does is it allows you to start putting in YAML a much more consumable way of tracking metadata. I will say that it's early days for the library, so there's things that will change and whatnot. This is just an early view of that, but more or less, this is reflecting the things that we currently track in the KEP. One of the other things, too, that we're trying to avoid is a centralized human-generated index, because those are notoriously prone to having merge conflicts and whatnot. So the idea in the long term is that metadata could be used to generate some sort of centralized index on a pre-submit type job or something like that. So again, automation as a key manager of that.
Yeah, and certainly, you can imagine that the publishing or rendering of KEP content for consumption in the contributor side, for instance, could be a step that happens after KEPs are merged. So it's something that's happening continuously. If you're thinking about managing KEP content like you would just normal code, you don't want to be CIing it and continuously delivering it to the users. In this case, it's often other contributors, the tech media who's interested in learning what's going on in the Kubernetes project.
All right, so moving on, again, we mentioned that KEPs are intended to serve many different audiences. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to be a little faster than I'm going. Yeah. There is a main stage session, or not main stage, but main
Birds
conference. The actual KEP and the regular KubeCon as well. So, so really, I think this is really important. Is the motivation is, as Caleb said, is really how do you get people to want to spend their last 10 minutes working on your thing? You're essentially trying to not only say what is the thing that's being solved, but really talk about the significance of the problem so that everybody can understand why they want to rally around it. And ideally, this helps sort of provide a de facto prioritization. Because when a SIG receives a KEP, it's competing against all the other KEPs in flight. It's competing against existing SIG roadmap initiatives or whatever those are that they have in mind. And for them to take on something new, they have to understand, wow, this is urgent. This is something that has value. It's something that needs to be done and bought into. And KEPs are a major way of doing that. So when Brian mentioned earlier about the Klog change, DIMS did that. He went to people and got critical mass. He wrote on mailing lists. He he took the initiative to convey the urgency and the significance of the problem. Obviously, that doesn't scale. That's part of the human element. So KEPs become a proxy for that human interaction and allow us to actually scale those requirements.
And since we just only have a few minutes left, do we have any the questions from the audience? Yeah?
So, and feel free to say this is like more detailed than you want to explain right now, but it's never quite been clear to me how long or large in scope a KEP is supposed to be. And so I kind of have a concrete example of this, right? So like, let's say you're doing version 2 of an API, right? And so you initially propose some features for version 2, and you implement those, and those are implemented, and you're sitting around in beta, and people are like, that's great, but really it needs this one tweak. And then so you go and add a couple more features and whatnot. How is that supposed to be expressed over the lifecycle of the KEP? Is there separate KEPs for each of those sets of features? Or is there supposed to be a holistic overarching KEP so that someone can track V2 as an API and go back and look at it?
The way I've been thinking about KEPs anyway has been you would have an overarching KEP so that you would track the graduation of an API from alpha to beta. You would track also in the KEP revisions that would cause breaking changes. So you'd be able to see the entire provenance for an API group that was added in one place.
All right, so you don't have to answer it here, but since I'm double booked over top of the KEP birds of a feather thing, hi, I'm the release lead for 1.14. I really want to use KEPs in 1.14. My straw man proposal is that what we have lacked thus far are clear exit criteria for beta and stable. One of those being a clear and obvious test plan, another being a clear and obvious upgrade and downgrade story that is tested and verified as working for end users. I feel like I would like to mandate that this is required for anything landing on 1.14. Tell me I'm wrong, or tell them that this is a bad idea and find an acceptable compromise at the session.
Yeah. All right, I think that's it. If you're interested in KEPs, find us.
Yes,
So-
and I guess last thing is the importance of the KEP process is to merge early. It's a tool for documenting consensus. And so as soon as you've got consensus about anything, merge it so we don't lose that consensus, that history for the project. Exactly.
Merge and iterate, that's the thing.
Cool. All right. Exactly. Now, we're out of time, so thank you all.
All right, so